Well, as a child, I don't think that you don't really discern very well. Your influences are based on what you hear, sort of what's in your environment. And so in my environment, those were some of the artists that were played. So Glenn Gould. On the violin side, there was Jascha Heifetz. It was always with my father, usually riding in the car, of all things. When we would go from one place to another, he would turn on the radio or have tapes that were ready-made, and we listened to these artists on the way. I studied, actually, I'm from Milwaukee, and I studied piano starting from age 7 in Chicago. So a lot of these musical encounters that I had took place on the way from Milwaukee to Chicago and back.
Did you have debates with your father about the merits of the music?
I don't think a 7-year-old was capable, as I was at that time, of debating. But I think my father, who's also a musician, what he did is he would bring out certain salient features of the music, and he would ask me to listen for certain features, and I did. He would talk about the sound of these artists. He would say, what do you notice about Glenn Gould's sound, or what do you notice about Horowitz's sound in comparison to Glenn Gould? The Glenn Gould sound was very articulate. It was somewhat dry. And it was very, for lack of a better word, sharp. It sounded almost beyond pianistic, as though there was a mechanism in place. And I mean that in the most positive sense, this almost superhuman technique. And the same can be true of Horowitz, but it was a different sound with Horowitz. It was a more romantic, more lush, much richer. And part of that has to do with, of course, how they played, how they approached the keyboard in terms of their finger articulation. But part of it is also the way that the instruments were recorded and how they were even serviced. That is, these pianos, the one that belonged to Glenn Gould, for example, compared to the one that belonged to Horowitz, were very different instruments. And so my father would constantly ask me to pay attention to the sound of the piano by itself, and if I could notice how each piano spoke, if that's the right word, differently to the listener. I don't see the term mechanical as a pejorative necessarily. I think that with the way I'm using it, the mechanism of technique means that the precision was absolute. And you find this to be the case with some of the great musicians and athletes as well, that they have absolutely precise control. So that the same way that you think of an engine that is fine-tuned to perfection, where everything is running, all the cylinders are running correctly, I would imagine the same can be said of some of the great artists, that they have absolute control and absolute space within their playing. There were occasions where my father, who played with the Milwaukee Symphony, there were occasions when he would go out of town with the symphony. They would go on a European tour. I remember I must have been, again, 6 or 7 when this happened, and they left for 2 weeks. And I had to practice every day on my own, of course, and the incentive was for every day I practiced, I got $1. So I amassed something like, I mean, it went beyond those 2 weeks. Ultimately, I amassed $25 or $30, and I considered myself quite wealthy. The practice sessions were daily, and this was in the home. And my father simply stood over me and worked with me for as long as it took. So I imagine that when I was small, the sessions went on for half an hour to an hour. Not too long, but to a child, that's a long time. So they felt very, very lengthy to me. And it was a lot of work on a daily basis. Then I also had a regular teacher, and I saw him every 2 weeks. So it definitely felt like work.
What was the most fun aspect of it? What was the thing that you looked forward to within the parameters of it?
Well, you say within the parameters, because
Yes.
I could have said once I was done. Once I was finished, that was always a huge relief.
Now, your father, excuse me, but he was a violinist, or is a violinist.
He is a violinist, yes.
And yet he was teaching you piano.
Yes. That seems to be, that was actually one point as I got older and I became a teenager who rebelled constantly. My father and I got into fights where I would say, well, how do you know you're a violinist and you can't possibly know what a pianist has to go through to manage this skill? And his answer was very simple. He said, I may be a violinist and you may be a pianist, but we're both musicians. I did have a piano teacher, and his name was Emilio del Rosario. And he died, unfortunately, some years ago, but he was someone I saw only every 2 weeks. My father, until I went away to college, so until I was 18 years old, my father came and sat in on every single piano lesson I had. So my father was never away from the environment. So that also speaks to why he could give me advice about playing the piano, because for as long as I played piano until I left for college, so those 13 years from the time I was 5 until 18, he heard every word that my teacher said to me because it was said to him just the same. My father could not execute the same pieces that I could at the piano, and yet he was offering me advice, which meant that the advice that he would suggest was always based on bigger issues, not put your second finger there or move your wrist this way, because that wasn't something that he could really speak to, but it was more of, you need to be more relaxed, or you need to produce a bigger sound here, or your tone in this passage needs to be rounder. His school was based on instilling a very solid foundation for technique. So that was really my teacher's primary focus. And I can be very specific about that. It's something that I continue to this day with my own students. So think of technique as a basic grammar. So just like if you're studying in school, you need to have a grammar for literacy, for arithmetic, for the basic subjects that everyone should know. So in piano playing, the basic grammar are scales and arpeggios, basic etudes by, let's say, Czerny or Moszkowski, and then going all the way up to the concert etudes by Chopin and Liszt. So these were pieces that I absolutely had to know and master. So it was all very regimented and all very methodical. When I was very young, and I don't remember this, but my father tells me this, my father and my teacher had a discussion of how my teacher would behave toward me during the lesson. Would he be very strict? Would he be more relaxed? Would he trust that I would get the work done at home? And my teacher basically said, should I behave with your son, that is me, the way that I behave with the majority of my students? And he had something to the number of 70 students at a time. And my father said, you know, don't be as strict, because I'll take care of that on a daily basis. And an example of his strictness was through the door when I was preparing for my lessons, waiting to come in and be the next student that my teacher saw. He would often shout to the students before me, "You play the same mistakes every week." That was one of his favorite lines, that I could hear him shouting through the door. And it was very aggressive, but it was correct. You know, sometimes this is the way you need to speak to a student, not to insult the student, but rather as a reality check, that you're not making progress the way you should be making progress. Now, my teacher didn't speak to me that way, because my father basically did the same thing, in the way that a father can do with his own child. One of the issues that I often deal with my own students is telling them not to be perfectionists. The problem with being a perfectionist is that you freeze, because you're so afraid of making a mistake that there can be no progress. That is, that once let's say that you're a musician who happens also to be a perfectionist, you've assembled an interpretation, a way of making your art. Let's say it's making music. And because you're a perfectionist, you can't tolerate any small change to that interpretation, because then the whole structure is so rigid that it would collapse, it would break into a million pieces. We make mistakes, and there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is not the mistakes, but how we treat the mistakes. So if someone makes a mistake and then runs away from the situation saying, well, I give up because a mistake has come up, that's where perfectionism has its worst side. But if you start by thinking mistakes are inevitable, and I will learn from how I treat the mistake, how I correct the mistake, how I process myself through the mistakes into something that's bigger and more interesting than the mistakes themselves. I encourage my students to at least fix one mistake, and if another one comes up, fix that one. I work with students who I know will not become professional musicians. Some of them certainly will, some of them won't. And sometimes that conversation is very essential. That is, why are we studying this now if you're not going to become a professional musician? And the answer is for the discipline. To understand that you can master a symbolic language, as music is, and be able to learn from it and apply it to parallel fields. In medicine, for example, if you're a surgeon, and I remember this from teachers of mine in grade school, who used to say, well, if you're a brain surgeon, your margin of error is 0. And if you're if you're a pianist, of course, no one, I hope, will suffer too much if you make a mistake. But you want to approach it as though you should not be making mistakes, only because I don't want to contradict what I said earlier, that mistakes, after all, are inevitable. We are human beings. But your goal is not to make the mistakes. Your goal is actually to transcend that way of thinking, am I playing correctly or incorrectly, and rather to think about larger musical, more profound issues of how to communicate emotion and structure and intelligence to a receptive audience. You have to find the passion in your life, and you take that seriously.
Right.
So if music happens to be your passion, you do it with no compromises. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, because life is funny that way. But sometimes you have to be able to say at the end of the day that you tried as hard as you could, and that it went beyond the circumstances that were under your control. That you put in the effort, you put in the discipline, and you're better for it, because you know what it means to take something seriously, to put your entire soul and heart and mind into something. I hate jinxing myself, but so far in my career on stage, I've had 1 or 2 occasions where the mistake has been so disastrous that I've had to stop. And those situations are certainly not pleasant, because you feel embarrassed. I mean, I felt embarrassed, certainly. But then you realize that, what's the big deal? An audience is very forgiving generally. And if the mistake is not such a game stopper that I have to actually cease performing and start over again, then most of the time the audience doesn't notice. So you're not making a mistake, or rather, you're not going out to perform thinking, who will be able to catch my mistakes? Because I think that's a very small-minded kind of exercise. And I mean small-minded in the sense that it's not interesting to go out and perform with mistakes in mind. It's much, much more interesting to come out and say, how will we share this experience? I on the side of the performance, and the audience on the side of my listeners. I think of it as in terms of attention span. Most people have varying attention spans, but it's unrealistic to think that every single moment of a performance is being taken in exactly the same way by any given audience member. So we listen to music, we start thinking about something that affects us emotionally in our own lives. A piece of music might recall something that happened earlier in one's life. And so at that moment, you're being transported to another place, another experience entirely, another association. And so if a mistake happens, it may go entirely unnoticed. So I think that the dilemma, if that's the right word, that a musician often goes through is, who am I doing this for when you're out on stage, when that person is out on stage? Am I playing for myself, or am I playing for myself and hoping that the feelings that I experience in the moment of performance, like a net, will be cast out over the audience, and they'll be brought into my world, the world that I'm creating right here and now, whether music needs to be emoted physically. And my answer, the short answer is, it has to be natural. So if an artist is naturally very exuberant and excessive physically, then so be it. I think that trying to cut someone into someone's dramatic physical read of the music is a mistake. However, and you might see this with younger performers who, because perhaps they lack the emotional depth of experience and time, try to play a piece of music that is actually very mature emotionally, sometimes to compensate for what they simply don't know yet. They try to put on a show, the facial grimaces, the eyes rolled back in the head, the flailing neck, and the arms. I've seen so many different things, and sometimes, very often, an audience knows that it's either natural or put on. And so this is, again, with my own students, what I try to teach is that you should not have any excessive movement, because all of that takes away from the energy that goes into the playing itself. Save the energy for the sound and for what will be communicated through the instrument, not by them watching you. My brother, who's a violinist as well, and in Chicago, So I played with him. I have played with him on occasion, not nearly as often as with my father, because my father, after all, as my direct mentor, he and I shared a lot, and continue to do so, even though he's now in his 80s. We still play together as often as we can. My brother and I don't, and I don't know if there's any reason for that. I have a very large age gap between myself and my siblings. My family is originally from Moscow, the former Soviet Union, and they left Moscow and immigrated to Jerusalem. And then after about 4 years in Jerusalem, they ultimately immigrated to Milwaukee. And my siblings were there starting from Moscow because they were born there. I was born much later in Milwaukee, so I missed all of the family saga that really revolved around this immigration. So what that means is that when I was small, my brother was already out of the house, living in a different state. My sister was almost 17 when I was born, and in another year she went off to college and she moved out of the house. So I had the best of both worlds, if you will. I was growing up as an only child, but simultaneously my siblings were around, of course, but just infrequently visiting. So what that means is that the daily experience that siblings have when they're much closer in age, when they live together and they breathe together and they talk together and they share experiences together, I didn't really have. The joke is that my father worked with my brother intensively every day. And there was a different reason why my father was as intensive with my brother than there was when my father worked with me. So when my father worked with my brother, that was still in the Soviet Union. And the fear was that if my brother didn't have a profession, he might end up going into the Russian army. And the same thing was true in Israel, that because Israel has compulsory military service, the fear was that when my brother turned 18, if they were still, had they still been living in Israel because they left before then, my brother would have to go into the military there as well. And that was a very difficult time in Israel's history, the mid-1970s and slightly earlier, when there were wars one after the other. So you can imagine the real stress that my parents were experiencing, and they felt viscerally that if my brother didn't have a profession, a career, then his, I don't think I'm exaggerating in saying they felt that his life was in danger if he didn't master the violin, and to the extent that he could have a profession, that he could find work. And fortunately he did. With me, it wasn't a life or death situation. I was the MTV generation, so I didn't have any one taste. I listened to MTV, I listened to the radio that played what MTV would play, and those were my tastes up until college, where I started to diversify slightly. But at that time, whatever was popular was, I was I was a sheep as much as anyone else was. If the wind blew one way, I went with it. What appealed to me is that it was popular. And this is an interesting moment for a child all the way up until age 18 who was playing classical music at home, where my friends were not into that culture, which is pretty normal, I think. I had my professional life, even as a small child, which was to play and learn classical music, to work with Mozart and Beethoven and Bach and Chopin and all the great dead composers. Dead European composers. And then on MTV you have living, breathing people of various origins, of various styles of music. That was extraordinarily appealing, to just for a moment get out of that zone that was, it felt sometimes, if I can say it, and I don't mean any of this negatively, but I mean it that sometimes my practice of piano was like being in a museum. So there's only so much that you can stand to be in a museum. It wears thin sometimes. So getting out and experiencing popular music was a way of rejoining living society. There was a period when I was listening to Bobby McFerrin, who's a great artist, actually, so I'm not embarrassed to mention his name. I'm just embarrassed that I was listening to Don't Worry, Be Happy all the time. There was a period when I listened to Mariah Carey because she was the it girl at the time. let's see, there were new kids on the block who were fairly new at the time when I was in probably 6th or 7th grade. But just like with some of today's younger artists, everyone listened to them, but a certain age bracket loved to hate them. And so that's what we were all doing, my friends and I, in 6th grade. We loved to hate the new kids on the block. You know, I think that it's possible to listen to a piece of musical art as a casual listener. And I think that for the music that I'm not necessarily playing, I do that. So with Jamiroquai, Virtual Insanity I think that was the first track that I was exposed to. That has a wonderful piano introduction. And you're right, that's something that you just can't help noticing. But I noticed it just as much as anyone else would who has enough of a sensitive ear to really listen and to pay attention. So that's the one thing I can say, is that when I listen to music that gets to me, I really pay attention. The music that speaks to me now is different from the music that spoke to me when I was 15, and I think that hormones play a big part in that. So when I was a hormonal teenager, I loved, from the music that I played, I loved the great romantic composers. So again, people such as Chopin and Liszt and Schumann and Wagner and Mahler, these over-the-top romantic, wear your heart on your sleeve kind of composers. As I get older and my perspective changes and I have a broader base of experience on which to draw, I discovered that there are more nuanced emotions present in the music of the Baroque. So Bach is part of that, certainly, but Bach really represents the late Baroque. There are some phenomenal pieces that go all the way back to the late 1590s and early 17th century, pieces by Monteverdi or pieces by Gabrieli.
Modern composers, could you share with us a few of the modern composers that you have a particular...
Well, I can tell you about the composers with whom I work, because I think at this stage in my career, it has to be very personal. So I've worked with several. The three that I can mention offhand, in order of how I encountered them, were Lucas Foss, and then Donald Harris and David Del Tredici.
What kind of question would you ask a composer about a specific piece?
Well, I often ask, how and why did you compose this music? And very often the answer is very unsatisfying, because I think that when someone is in the throes of the creative process, the analytical brain is not necessarily as aware as the combination of instinct with intellect. It's all a fusion, and I think that when people in a very romantic, cliched way talk about being in a trance and creating in that trance, there's some truth to that. So most of the time, in my experience, when I've asked a composer, how and why did you compose and what were the circumstances, the answers are, I don't remember, I don't know, I just did.
Have they given you ever a satisfactory answer that totally turned you onto the piece in a new way?
They've said, I composed from my gut instinct, which means that I have some level of freedom as a performer, which means I can interpret the piece from my gut as well.